Hey, welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest and head distiller at Birdseye, Indiana's own Old Homestead Distillery. So tonight, we're going to give you part one of perhaps my favorite historical ghost. The ghost that started all of this for me. The one that I'm not sure if I found him or he found me or we found each other. But nonetheless, we're going to start with a biographical sketch first. In part two, we'll get into the good details. It's not often I get a chance to have crossover between multiple of my projects, such as If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything. Our podcast, wherever you get your podcasts at, please go check it out if you're at all into the paranormal, the Fortean, high strangeness, spirituality, or magic. I think you'll really enjoy it. And the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, over on YouTube, as well as Old Homestead and these Stories from the Stead products. I don't know if products is the right word, but we're going to leave it in there because I don't feel like doing a lot of editing tonight. Anyways, John Bowman was born in 1818, the son of William and Catherine Bowman, who immigrated from Blount County, Tennessee. Originally, William was from Virginia, while the wife was from Pennsylvania. John was the second of 11 children, and the eldest of his brothers. John, who spent his childhood on the Walnut Ridge just north of Salem, Indiana, working as an apprentice at his Uncle John's cabinet shop, and traveling south frequently via flatboats owned by Mellott and McFeeters, while walking back up the Natchez Trace in order to secure his future fortune. When his father William died in 1845, he left the two youngest children in a bad state, and the mother as well. John Jr., or J.A. as he was known, stepped up and took them in. Bowman was educated in the local primary schools, the common schools of the time. No mention is ever made of any further education for John Bowman other than his known involvement in the Knights of Pythias and the local Freemasons. John began purchasing vast acreages of land at the age of 20, but no mention has ever been recorded or survived of where his money originally came from, other than that it was an inheritance from some mysterious family member. Perhaps the well-known George and Pleasant Bowman family of Virginia. Never been able to prove this relationship, but I highly suspect that this is the case. Bowman didn't squander this money, but used it to further his investments. Bowman's main line of income was in fine stock, horses, mules, and cattle in particular, and the Bowman family were very well known throughout the South as traders in extraordinarily fine stock. They were particularly renowned in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Bowman made frequent trips south up until the outbreak of the Civil War, which he regarded in some ways as the death of his business. However, he was undeterred, and he continued to make several trips south by light of the moon during the conflict. In 1842, Bowman bought the farm where he would locate the remainder of his life, and later move his mother, brother, and sister into. Located now between Monsinger and Ferriby stations on the old Monon route, the one that they're currently turning into a walking trail in my backyard. Began building a beautiful Federalist-style house with transom windows, a foyer, a study, large kitchen, office, and an upstairs ballroom for entertaining guests. The house even had a type of membrane guttering system that led to a large cistern in order to collect the water for agricultural pursuits and home use. The farm was complete with many barns, a spring house made of massive blocks of Indiana limestone from Harristown Crossing, and would in time become a local tourist destination along the Bowman Road, known as Spurting Springs. Ornate gas lighting and molding, as well as chandeliers, were added over time. A smithery was actually built by a workhand just down the hill for production of needed iron, and the bricks were actually built on site by the workmen. A massive root cellar was located on the south side and was entered via a trapdoor in the kitchen. Bowman also delved into Hoosier politics, serving both pre- and post-war. First 2 years in the House of Representatives, and later 8 years in the Senate. He also started the Salem State Bank in 1878, which he later sold to Lee W. Sinclair, and was stockholder in the New Albany State Bank. As a side note, Bowman and Sinclair were incredibly close, and they seem to have taken their beliefs and understanding in fraternities very seriously. Bowman passing wealth on to Sinclair, Sinclair passing his wealth on to Charles Ballard to some degree. It's sort of a system of taking people under your wing and helping them up, giving them a helping hand. Bowman was a large hand in organizing both the Washington County Fair held in Salem, Indiana, and the Clark and Washington and Floyd County Fair held in what would become Gills Grove, later known as Pekin Park. In 1846, he became a stockholder in the New Albany and Salem Railroad. John understood that this railroad was going to be very important for commerce and for travel, especially for politicians and those who might own stock in banks in multiple different cities, who might need to make trips north to Indianapolis, south to Louisville, and or might need to make their way to New Albany, Indiana to check on their various different interests. He also understood that this railroad spur line would connect into wider railway lines that ran south and would be a boon to his business and stock trading, which he had continued. He actually lobbied to have the route of the then New Albany and Salem Railroad changed. This is why if you look at a map of Washington County and you look at the railroad, there is a huge curve that sort of bows out towards Harristown Crossing before coming back in, heading straight for Salem, Indiana, adding some mileage to the actual route. Bowman is the reason for this, because along that track, which split his farm at the time, he built large stock barns with huge embankments and also had his own railroad depot placed there for visitors coming to the home at that time. The embankments were there so that you could easily pull boxcars up and the doors would be level with the bank, and you just have to lay down boards or a ramp of some sort to run the stock onto the train to send them back south. Bowman, his involvement with the railroad isn't very well documented, but it is known, and it is a big piece of Washington County oral history that gets overlooked quite often. John remained a bachelor for many years and was very secretive about his age, prompting Horace Heffron to often goad him in his Pioneer Pickings articles by publishing his home address, marital status, and wishing that John would reveal something of himself, as he would be considered an interesting fellow and perhaps Washington County's most eligible bachelor. He finally married Miss Mary Jane Davis Howell, January 17th of 1881. No children were born of this marriage, but Miss Howell did have one daughter from a previous marriage named Flora. Mr. Bowman himself passed September 22nd, 1886, and that's where the story gets really interesting. But before we touch on that, I want to touch on another interesting factor about Mr. Bowman. So Mr. Bowman is what you would have known as a peace Democrat, somewhat of a Southern sympathizer to some degree, at least publicly facing. This is because his business mostly lied in the South. He was well known, as we said, for trading horses and mules, etc., and no doubt, I'm sure, that he did sell some of those various different livestock to some of the Confederates at one point in time. However, being located in Washington County, which was kind of equally split between these Peace Democrats and the Quakers at the time, and being along the railroad route, I can tell you an interesting factor. I firmly believe that John Bowman was playing both sides of that coin. I think that John Bowman was actually a part of the Underground Railroad. There is no proof that he was, but I will tell you that I was involved in the restoration of his house, which I will talk about in the second part of this video to some degree. And I can tell you that there very clearly was a hidden compartment in the basement that actually had initials and names scratched into it, dating from the time period when John Bowman actually owned this house. It would not surprise me, not one bit, to learn that Mr. Bowman was actually helping slaves escape slavery into Washington County. Once they got to Salem, especially to a couple, either side of Salem, there were multiple Quaker settlements there that would have helped these people on their way either further north or even potentially into Canada as well, as that was a very common thing at the time. So Mr. Bowman may not have been everything that he appeared to be publicly facing. I can also tell you that I know for a fact that when the Morgan's Raiders split and the one small faction came into Pekin before meeting back up with the other faction on the other side of Salem, the small faction that came to Pekin were riding worn-out horses. Some of them were even riding mules that were stolen. They were riding them hard, they were wearing them out. Sometimes the animals were even dying. The route that they chose actually bypassed Pekin. It went through what was known as Old Pekin and came out on the Tash Road, which is at that time was known as the New Albany and Salem Turnpike, out on what is now known as Blue River Road, across from the Tash House. That road ran directly over the hill behind Eastern School. It continued to follow that path, basically where Monsignor Road now exists, all the way to John Bowman's house. Mr. Bowman is the one who actually headed up the militia element who put down that faction of Morgan's Raiders and ran them away from the area. I suspect that John got word that those men were coming into the area. Those men were in need of new horses, and they knew where to get them. John Bowman was where they were going to get them, and they weren't going to pay for them. And John Bowman was not going to stand for that. This is why he headed up that Indiana militia. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details of his burial at this exact moment, because I'll save that for part 2. But I will tell you, Mr. Bowman was buried next to the tracks, the same tracks that they are now making into a railroad trail for rails to trails. He's buried on what's known as Dead Man's Corner. Trains used to come through and honk at it every night, because right next to the tracks is the tallest obelisk in Washington County. And if you were going south and you were a train engineer headed towards Louisville, Kentucky, you would come around that corner from Salem, Indiana, and the first thing you'd see in your light at midnight would be the obelisk of John A. Bowman, who wanted to be buried next to the tracks because he so loved the train that, as he told his wife, he wanted to feel it rattle his old bones in death. And death is really only where this story starts, because if ever there was someone who thought he was coming back, John Bowman is that someone. Oh hell, you'd have thought I've done enough of these to remember. I forgot my little catchphrase. From our hearts and hearts to yours. Love y'all.